Hello, and welcome to episode 8 of the Code Breakdown. I'm your host, Andrew DuPont.
And I'm Brian Miller.
In this episode, what are we going to be working on, Brian?
It looks like we're doing state-based testing versus behavioral
Oh,
testing
that's
based upon
right.
the feedback that you got.
Yeah. So, do you just want to break it down? I mean, we got to at least define the two and then provide some examples. And then I feel like we'll just see where that takes us.
I think that sounds great.
Okay. So, we have a good example of this actually just from even working on Code Breakdown itself, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, and that is subscriptions. The concept of subscriptions, because subscriptions can be active or inactive. So, do you just want to start doing this by writing some specs?
Yeah, I mean, actually, it might help me if you revisit what exactly the high-level differences between state and behavioral testing are.
Sure. Okay, so if we start, let's just start with state-based tests, because those are the most common and what people are used to. State-based tests are really anytime you are verifying the initial state or the end result state after some operation or before some operation. So these are actually what people generally think of in terms of classic unit tests, basically, because people generally think of, like, I don't know, you call a method that does some string alteration or something like that, and they're testing that when this method is called with this value, that the return value of that method is some result, right? Their expectation is that result.
Mm-hmm.
So that's very much a state-based test, because you're saying, given this initial state and then calling this method, our resultant state should be this value, right?
All
So
right.
that's a state-based test. Behavioral tests, on the other hand, they're more around defining the behavior of code and what code should do. So, for instance, if a method, it has to call out to some other object and perform a method on another object, or interact with another object, and that's super important. Generally, that's where behavioral tests are used. So instead of defining the expectation on the result of a method or some process, you're defining expectation on the behavior that is going to happen during some part of that process.
Oh, okay. So for behavioral testing, that's when I would be using some of those message expectations that are provided to see if something is called in a specific way that I'm expecting.
Yeah, so like in our spec, right, we have something like some object or whatever the subject usually should receive like hello, right? And that's defining an expectation that whatever the subject object is should receive a method call of hello, right?
All right.
And that's exactly where you would use this type of thing. State-based testing would simply be like subject say hello should equal hello, right?
Got it.
Something like that.
So I'm with state-based testing. I'm going to be far more interested in the what the methods or members of that object, what values they have, or what particular the result of certain actions are.
Exactly.
All right. So we want to jump into the subscribe?
Sure. So, given that we have this concept of subscriptions, and subscriptions can either be inactive or active, and that there also needs to be a process for activating a subscription, I think that's probably a decent example which will let us show both state-based testing and behavioral testing, and also kind of give an example where we can discuss why it makes sense to use state-based testing in certain cases and why it makes sense to use behavioral testing in other cases. So let's start out by saying we have this concept subscription. We need to define a class for subscription. Okay, so we have a basic class. And we need some way to activate the subscription, right? So the question is what does this do? It records that the subscription has been activated, right?
Well, seems like a kind of a Boolean state, a yes or no. So we could probably throw that into some sort of instance variable in the class, right?
Yeah, I think so. I think that makes sense. So we can do something like subject dot activate bang. I'd just start with this normally just to drive out the test, although that's not what I wanted. Undefined method activate bang. So def activate bang. Okay, so we have that green. So now let's iterate over this and refactor this test a little bit. So we want to verify the state that this subscription has been activated, that it's recorded. So subject dot, if we're dealing what we said and we're using an instance variable to store a Boolean value, then we can do subject dot instance variable get active.
I think that sounds good.
And that should be true after this, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we can run this test. And we got nil. So we then need to have this guy actually set this to true. And we are passing.
So you want to explain that little Rubyism with the bang there?
Sure. Yeah. So it's common practice in Ruby to use bangs to symbolize with a method name that it alters internal state of whatever object that method is called on. So in this case, we have the subscription, and it's calling activate bang, which tells us just from reading some code like this that we know that that action actually alters the internal state of that object. In this case, it's altering the internal state of the instance variable active and setting it to true. But generally, that's where you see that. There's a couple other places where people go against that convention. Rails goes against that convention in a few places, but generally, it's fair to either know that this is altering internal state, or it's a symbol to represent loudness, like throwing an exception versus returning an error value.
Yep.
But generally, it's the case of altering internal state, and that's how you should think about it. So we now have a green passing test for activate bang, such that it records that the subscription has been activated, right?
Yep.
So this, per our little example up here, very much matches a state-based test. If I didn't delete it, there we go. It very much matches the state-based test style, right? We are calling a method given some initial state, and we are verifying that the end result of that, whether it's the state of the return value of that method or the state of an object that that method exists on, is some end resultant state that we care about. In this case, we care that it's true, right? So what else do activations do? We probably also need to record when the activation happened, right?
That would be helpful.
So let's say it records the activation timestamp when it has been activated. So we're going to have the same thing here. We're going to store this again in an instance variable. And let's call it activation timestamp, right? Should start with should not be nil, something like that.
Yeah, I think that's probably appropriate. We're not. We just want to make sure that it's set.
Yeah, I don't want to get too deep down.
Yeah, because then we'll have to pull out something like time comp to try to freeze the time so we can make sure it matches, or
yeah,
turn this into a behavioral test.
Yeah. And then let's set this to time now, or I guess that'll work.
Mm-hmm.
Cool. So now we have another test, which also matches the original pattern that we had up here for state-based tests. We're again checking the internal state of the object that we're testing in this case, which is the subscription object.
All right.
So, what else does activations?
Well, when we were talking earlier about this, well, we wanted this thing to interact with some sort of credit card transaction, because eventually, if you have a subscription, you want to get paid for it, right?
That's true. So, activating also requires interacting and telling some sort of credit card processing system to charge the credit card, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I guess we'll just say it charges the subscription's credit card. Something like that.
Mm-hmm.
So let's assume that there's some credit card processor.
All right.
And in this case, we want to say that this credit card processor should receive a charge message with some credit card. Right?
Yep.
Let's stub out the credit card that's passed to that. And we want to test that this happens when we activate the subscription, right? So let's start with that. Uninitialized constant credit card processor, because we haven't added one. So let's just write one real quick. Credit card processor. All right, so now we have a failure saying that it expected that the charge message on the credit card processor would get called one time, but it received 0 calls. So that means we need to add a method to credit card processor, right? Credit card processor. And the credit card processor needs a charge method. Actually, it's a class level method. So what does it do? It exists.
It accepts a credit. Yeah, it exists is really what we're.
I mean, for now, we'll change it as the test evolves. Let's not do subject. Well, let's do subject equals the credit card processor class itself. And subject dot charge. All right, undefined method charge on the class. So let's go up here. This guy needs a def self charge, and that makes that pass. So it's not just that it exists, we also need it charges the given credit card, right?
Yep.
Stub, which is some credit card. All right, wrong number of arguments there. It's because we need to make this take a credit card. run that again. All right. So now we have a method, and let's just assume that this actually does what it's supposed to. Whoa, sorry. This should actually be, let's pretend that this is actually provided by a library, right? So like Braintree or some other credit card processing provider out there has basically given us a gem that provides this credit card processor class. And it has a charge method, and that charge method takes a credit card object of some sort, right?
Well, that is one of the nice things about the behavioral test is that we don't necessarily have to worry about what it's doing within the subscription test. We're just testing that we're calling it with the correct pieces.
Yes, and we're testing that it does get called, right? So if we run the test again, it's still complaining that it hasn't been called as we have it currently defined. So let's comment out the with and see. It's still not called, right? But I want to comment out the with just to simplify the test. So we need to make sure that that charge is called. So how do we call charge? We just add a charge here to credit card processor charge with something. I don't know, anything here for now. And we go back and run our tests, and it's all passing now, right? So now let's add our constraint back, which is that it's called with the credit card. Okay, so now it's saying that it expected to receive it with the stub of credit card, but it got it with that string that I slimed in the initial call. So here we want it to be the credit card that is tied to the subscription, right? So that means we need to have some way of assigning an actual credit card to a subscription. So let's just say that we have an adder accessor of credit card, right? And that is whatever it is.
We'll assume it gets tested somewhere else.
Yeah.
Or I'm sorry, assigned somewhere else in some other process.
Yeah. So here we have, we would then have whatever the subject is, dot credit card equals credit card. Okay, and we're still getting our slime value because this needs to pass credit card. Cool.
All right.
So we now have a passing test here, which is verifying that our third-party credit card processor's charge method is being called and handed the credit card that is tied to our subscription object. And then we're verifying that that happens when the activate method is called on our subscription. So this is a prime example of a behavioral test. And you can see that based on the pattern of the expectation style inside the test is a should receive of some method call. And it very much matches that example that I showed before. So one thing you'll notice is that the order of which things change in terms of writing your test depends on what type of test you're writing. If you look at the two state-based tests, you'll notice that the actual method is called first, and our expectation comes second. In the case of a behavioral test, our expectation comes first, and then our call to the actual method happens. Thanks for watching another episode of the Code Breakdown. I'm your host, Andrew DuPont.
And I'm Brian Miller. Until next time.